Hello, it's Chris here. Welcome to another episode of the MySQL series. In this lesson, we're going to start building our iOS app to connect to, or rather to hit this service that we built in the previous lesson to grab this JSON data and then parse it so that we can display it inside the app. Alright, so we're going to get started. We're going to jump right into Xcode here, and I'm starting a new project. Make sure you're looking at iOS. Let's choose single view application, and I'm going to call this MySQL demo app. And you can copy my settings here. The important one to note really is this one. Make sure that you're selecting Swift. Device is iPhone, and I don't have any of that checked on. I'm just going to save it on the desktop there. And the first thing we are going to do, we're not even going to touch the storyboard right now. We'll leave the user interface to the next lesson, but right now I just want to work on parsing the JSON data that we download from this service. So before we dive into any code, the first thing we need to do is take a look at this diagram about how this app is going to be structured. And I don't even really want to call it an app because it's more of like a demo. So in the middle there, we have the view controller, and that's the default view controller that comes with our single view application. And we have a viewcontroller.swift file to represent that class. So this view controller is going to be displaying a table view of our locations. And we only have two locations, the Apple headquarters and the Google headquarters, but there's nothing to stop you from adding more to your database. But anyways, it's going to be a table view that's going to show two rows. When you tap on one of those rows, you're going to go off to a map view. So we have another detail view controller or map view controller, just a second view controller, which is going to display the map and the selected location designated by a pin on the map. Now, in order to get the data from our PHP web service, we're not going to have the view controller directly hit that service and download the data. We're going to have another class, and that's going to be our home model. Now this class is going to be in charge of actually making the call to the web service, downloading the data, parsing the JSON data, and then returning to the view controller a list of locations for it to display in the table view. And the last piece of the puzzle is that we need some sort of data structure or class to represent each location. So we're going to create a location class that represents a single location. It's going to have a name, address, a latitude, and a longitude. And furthermore, the home model, when it parses that data, it's going to be creating those location objects. It's going to create an array of those objects, and it's going to pass that whole entire array back to the view controller, as you can see in this diagram here. And then furthermore, when the user taps on the table view and selects a location, the view controller is going to pass the selected location object to the map view controller, and it's going to take that and read the latitude and longitude properties and display it. Okay, with that said, let's dive back into Xcode and let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a couple of different classes. Let's create so under iOS, choose Cocoa Touch class. We're going to create our home model class first. So let's call it home model. It's going to be a subclass of n as object, and the language is Swift. I'm going to create that right there. And we're also going to create our location class. But actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it doesn't need to be a class. It can simply be a struct. And if you don't know what it is, let me try and think of a good example for this. But technically speaking, the class is a reference type, and struct is a value type. Now, this probably warrants its own video to explain the difference between the two, but if we're talking about the scenario in our app here, so take for instance, we were talking about how the home model would create a bunch of location objects. So let's say location was a class. The home model would create a whole bunch of location objects, and it would pass that array of objects to the view controller. Now you can kind of think about this as sort of a handoff. So the home model is handing off the array of location objects to the view controller. So even though the home model has a reference to the list of location objects, and then once it passes it to the view controller also has a reference to that array of location objects, it's the same set of location objects. So if you change something in one of the location objects, it's going to be reflected in both the home model and the view controller because they're both referencing the same list of location objects. However, if location was not a class, instead if it was a struct and it's a value type, when the home model passes that array of location structs to the view controller, it's going to get copied instead. So now the home model has its own list or copy of locations, and the view controller also has its own copy. So if the view controller modifies one of the locations in that list of location structs, it's not going to affect the copy that the home model has. So that's kind of the difference. Now, which one you use obviously is going to depend on how it's going to be used in your application. If making copies like that doesn't matter, and it's not going to matter for us because we're merely displaying this data, we aren't interested in modifying it and then passing it around between different view controllers and such. Copies are fine for us. So we're going to use structs, which turns out is a more lightweight way to represent that data anyways. So like I said, this probably warrants its own video in itself where I can demonstrate a live example in code for you guys. But for now, I hope that kind of makes sense. So when we create a struct, we don't choose Cocoa Touch class, we're just going to choose a Swift file. So I'm going to call this location, and it's going to create a location.swift here, and it's going to be an empty Swift file. And instead of the keyword class, we're going to use struct, going to use location. You still have that set of curly brackets, and then here we're going to declare some of those properties. So name, I'm going to set it to an empty string. What do we have? We have address, we have latitude, and we have longitude. Okay, so that's pretty much all we need for that. Let's jump back into the home model here. Because the data is going to be downloaded asynchronously, we're going to need to have a way to contact the view controller back when it's finished downloading. Okay, so we're going to use delegates and protocols to do that. First, let's create this function to get items. The view controller is going to be calling this function. So in this function, we are going to hit the web service URL, download the JSON data, parse it out into location structs, notify the view controller, and pass the data back. So those are kind of the high level steps that we're going to take. All right, so actually let's not worry about the protocol and delegate stuff now. Let's just focus on this stuff in order like this. It's going to make it a little easier to understand. So first let's declare our web service URL. So let service URL equals, and this is simply going to be our iosquiz.com/service.php. And then next, we are going to use a URL session class to download the data. So let session, actually we need to create a URL first, a URL object. There is a URL class. And there is an initializer that just takes a string, this guy right here. So we're going to initialize this URL with this string right here. Like that. And if you notice, let me do that again. If you notice that this initializer returns an optional URL type, so potentially it could return nil. Okay, so we're going to need to check against that. So if let URL equals URL, So if it comes into here, then that means that the URL object is not nil. The next thing we're going to do is create a URL session. So let's put that into a constant named session, and the class is URL session. We use this one, configuration, and we can use the default configuration. If you just press dot, it's going to autocomplete is going to show you the options that you're going to select from. Select default, and then we are going to create a task. So we are going to say create a constant that we're going to assign the task into, and you create the data task off of the session you just created. So data task, there's a couple ones you could create. We're going to create this one with passing in the URL with a completion handler, which means that after this task has completed, we're going to run that closure. And closure is just a block of code. So the URL is going to be this guy right here. So let's just put that into there as a parameter. And the completion handler, it has three parameters. So data, response, and error. And notice that these are all optional parameters, meaning that they all could be nil. So I'm just going to put that as data, response, and error. First thing to do in this closure is check the error parameter. So if error is not equal nil, sorry, if there is no error, meaning if the error is nil, then that means it succeeded. We got some data back, or rather, no, we didn't get data back, but it's just succeeded because the data could still be nil, else error occurred. Okay, and I like to do this step before I finish typing the code for the closure, because I often forget this. Creating the task like this is not sufficient enough to start the task. You actually have to manually give the command task.resume, and that's going to start running this data task. Okay, so I like to put that there first because I often forget it, and then I run the app and nothing happens, and I wonder why nothing happened. Start the task, and then in here we're going to take that data and we're going to parse it out, turn it into the location structs. Now I don't want to do that in this code right here, as this closure is already getting pretty huge. So I'm actually going to take that out and put it into another function down here, and I'm going to call it Parse JSON, and it's going to accept the data right here. So I'm just going to force unwrap that because this is an optional that could be nil, and obviously this is an error right now because it's home model does not have any parse JSON function. So we're going to go down here and we're going to create it. First of all, let me write this comment. Call the parse JSON function on the data. Okay, so let's erase this line because that's what we're doing here. And you got to be careful when you're writing this code because this function is getting pretty long. You see that? You want to make sure you declare your function in the right place. So it's got to be after this function, right? After this bracket here, but it's got to be within the home model class. So it's got to be before this closing brace, meaning it's got to be right here. It might seem a little confusing to you, but if you've done this, if you just continue working at it and continue building apps and writing code, then it should be natural to you to understand that. And furthermore, as you're typing out your code, make sure that your brackets kind of line up so it's easy to read as well. So you can see here that proper indentation goes a long way. See, I can draw a straight line down and I can know that this bracket is for closing that guy out. And if, for example, this if statement, if I draw a straight line down, I can see that this closing bracket is to close this if statement here. So that goes a long way to troubleshooting your code later on. Okay, so this parse JSON function, it's going to need a parameter, right? Because we are passing data. So I'm just going to call it data, and it's going to be of type data. And it's still going to be error out because if I do it like this, it's going to expect a label. So let me show you what that means. See, it's going to have to look like that. You see that extra label there? That's because of this guy right here. If you don't understand the difference between labels and arguments in your functions, review the Learn Swift for Beginners video, functions. I forget exactly which lesson that is. It might be lesson 9, I'm guessing, but I'm going to find out. I'm going to link to that lesson in the description below so that you can go review that. Now, the way, if you don't want to have a label there, you can actually use the underscore and kind of tell Xcode that we don't need a label. Okay, so inside this function here, we are going to, let me do some line breaks to move this code up so it's easier to see for you guys. In here, we're going to parse the data into location structs. So in this parse JSON function, we're basically going to take the data that's passed in, and we're going to use this JSON serialization class. There is a type method called JSON object with, you pass in the data, and then you have a couple of options, and it returns any, because it doesn't know, if your JSON is an array or a dictionary or anything like that. We know the JSON that's returned from our service is an array of dictionaries. We know that, but obviously when they wrote this function, they didn't know what our JSON would look like. So it returns any. We're going to need to cast that to an array. And notice this keyword throws. So if during this operation of converting the data to this JSON array, if there's some sort of error, this function is going to throw an error. So we have to encapsulate this with a special error block to catch that error if it so happens to throw one. And I'll show you how to do that. Well, let's select this function here, and we're going to pass in data. And for options, we're not going to specify any options. We're just going to specify 2 angle brackets like that to indicate an empty array here. All right, so we're going to cast this as an array of any. And then we are going to assign the results to a constant called JSON array. And remember that throws keyword. When there is a throws keyword like that, we need to put this try keyword in front of it. So this denotes that it's going to try to do this, and it kind of indicates also that this function may throw an error. So the way we catch the error, or the potential error, is by putting this code inside a do catch block. So this is how you do it. You use the do keyword. You put that statement inside a pair of curly brackets like this, and then right underneath you put the catch with its own set of curly brackets, and if it comes into this catch block, that means there was an error. However, if there is no error, then it's going to continue doing the code inside this do block here. So if there are no errors, we should have an array of any inside this JSON array. What we're going to do next is loop through this JSON array by using a for loop. So for each result, maybe we'll say JSON result in the JSON array. We know from this here that we actually have an array of dictionaries, right? So there's one dictionary, comma, followed by the second dictionary right there. And inside each dictionary, it's a series of key value pairs where the key is a string and the value is a string as well. That goes for all of the key value pairs inside our dictionary. So inside here, we're going to say that let JSON dictionary equals JSON result as, and we're going to cast this as a string. So that is a shorthand format for a dictionary where all of the keys are strings and all of the values are strings as well. Okay, so now we have this JSON dictionary ready to be used. We are going to create a new location object. So let lock equals location, like that. And there's this handy initialization method where it's going to basically set all of the properties that we have, name, address, latitude, and longitude, to whatever we pass in here. So we can do something like this, where we can pass in JSON dictionary, and then we specify the key, which capital N name, right? So we can specify that as the key. And because when you retrieve a value from a dictionary like this, if that key doesn't exist, it's going to return nil or nothing. And so this actually returns an optional value. We're going to have to add an exclamation mark there to force unwrap that optional to get at the string. Now, if it so happens that your dictionary is missing this name key value pair, then this code will probably break, because we are going to be passing nil into this name parameter here. So I'm not afraid to do this right here, because we can see our code right here. The safer way to do it, if you wanted to be extra careful, is probably to declare the name up here, like lock name as a constant equals JSON dictionary, like that. And then you try to cast it as a string, and then you would test if this was nil or not before assigning it to your location. However, that's a lot of extra code, which I'm not going to bother with now, but I just wanted to point it out to you. So the address, the key is address. Again, force unwrap it. And the key here is latitude. Force unwrap that. Force unwrap that. Okay, so we have this location struct now, which has all of its properties set to the values of this JSON dictionary. And then when it finishes creating this location, we're going to assign it into an array ready to be passed back. However, we need to declare that array to store our locations. So let's declare that way up here. Var location array is equal to that. We're going to have to declare it as an empty array that is going to be storing these location structs here, and we're going to now append it. Oops, not contents of. We're just going to use append new element, and we're going to pass in lock. And then what happens is it's going to loop through into the next result in the JSON array, and then it's going to do the same thing, creating another location and adding it to the location array. So here, let me add some comments. Cast JSON result as a dictionary, create new location and set its properties, add it to the array. Here, loop through each result in the JSON array, and here this is where parse the data into a JSON object. Okay, so after this for loop, we're going to have this lock array, filled with those locations. So we need to, down here, pass the location array back to delegate. In this case, the delegate, well, we're intending it to be view controller. Right now we haven't written the code yet, but we're going to intend that to be the view controller. Okay, so I'm going to leave this as a to-do right now, because before we implement that, let's go back to review what we've done here. So in the home model class, we have this get items function, right? It's going to hit this service URL. It's going to download that JSON data here, right? And then it's going to pass that data to our parse JSON function, and then it's going to parse it, and at the end of the day, we're going to have this locations array. Now from the view controller, it's got to trigger the get items function to happen, right? So let's go ahead and write that code here. In view controller, we're going to declare up here a new home model. I'm gonna just create a new home model object and assign it to that. And then in the view.load, we're going to initiate calling the items download. So let's go ahead and call that function, home model dot, whoops, not the class, home model with a lowercase h, because that's what we called this property up here, dot get items. Right, so when the view controller gets initiated, it's going to call home model dot get items. Okay, so then that's going to trigger the home model to do all of this stuff. And then down here, when it gets down here, it needs a way to contact the view controller back and pass that data back to the view controller. This is all happening in the background asynchronously. So the way we're going to have the home model communicate back to the view controller is by using protocols and delegates. So why don't we go up here in the home model and declare a new protocol? So you do this actually above the class declaration. You go protocol, and you say the common convention is to call it home model delegate. Start some curly braces like that, and we're going to have one function, items downloaded, and this is going to pass back an array of locations. So I'm going to say locations, location. It's an array of locations. So we're not going to implement this function here, right? We're just declaring this as a protocol. In other words, if the view controller is going to conform to this protocol, then it must implement this function. The second step to this pattern is inside the home model class, we declare a property var home or var delegate. This delegate is an instance of home model delegate, and it's optional, so this could be nil. So how this works is the view controller over here first declares that it conforms to this home model delegate protocol. Okay, so if it conforms to this protocol, it's going to have to set itself as the delegate. So view controller is going to assign itself to the delegate property of the home model, and because it's saying that it follows this protocol, the way we've declared it here, anybody who follows this protocol must implement this items downloaded function. So let's go down here and declare that items downloaded. Right, this is the protocol function. So we're going to leave it as an empty declaration here. We're going to jump back to home model. And so now home model merely needs to check, has anybody assigned itself into my delegate property? If so, then let's call the delegates items downloaded implementation. So down here, that's how we're going to pass the location array back. We're going to say delegate dot items downloaded, and we're going to pass the location array back to the delegate. All right, this is good for now. We're going to go back to the view controller, and in here we're just going to set a breakpoint right there. So what's going to happen now when the home model gets down to here, it's going to access this delegate property, right? And the view controller has assigned itself to the home model's delegate property. So what happens is the home model ends up calling the view controller's items downloaded function implementation. which happens to be this guy right here. So in theory, we should get back the location array through this parameter. So let's check that we do. Let's run our application now, and what should happen is the home model get items function is going to get called. It's going to go download the JSON here, exposed by our service, and then we're going to get the items back here. Actually, we forgot one thing, and it's telling us right here in the debug console, app transport security has blocked a clear text HTTP resource load since it is insecure. So what it's saying is that it's blocked access to this HTTP resource because it's not HTTPS. And what we can do about that is in this info.plist we can add an exception to allow these arbitrary loads. So if you click this little plus icon, it's under app transport security settings. Okay, so I'm going to expand that and then press the plus again to add a key. Allow arbitrary loads, we're going to change that to yes, and then run the app again, and that's going to allow our app to reach out to this URL. But remember what I said, in a production setting, you should probably get an SSL certificate and secure that URL and use HTTPS instead. But for this demo, I'm not going to go through that. So here it's reached our breakpoint in the view controller for items downloaded. So I can do something like PO locations and take a look at that parameter that gets passed into this delegate function. And you can see here I have two elements inside this locations array. You can see here for each location its properties are filled with the appropriate data. This is the data that we exposed through this service URL. So now we're going to go back, and we know this is working. That's it for this lesson. I just wanted to download the JSON exposed by the service and to parse it. Now it's ready to be used to display in our user interface. If you have any trouble following along with this lesson, go ahead and download the source code. I'm going to provide a link to the project in the description below the video. Alright, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.